The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is indeed a privilege to be able to stand and speak in the 51st Parliament, and as is tradition, I'd like to acknowledge the speakers, but you in particular, Mr Speaker, from just another sitting duck to the person holding the shotgun.
Order.
You have moved up the ranks to someone now. I just hope you get the right targets, Mr Speaker, in your new role. Mr Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge all the new MPs, some spectacular and wonderful maiden speeches here. I'd like to acknowledge the retreads and in fact everyone who's had the privilege of being elected to this Parliament, but in particular constituent MPs who I have a passion for, because those people, and I'd like to think myself, I guess have won the trust of a geographical area of a country and have the responsibility to represent all the hopes and aspirations of those people. Mr Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the team that helped me get back into Parliament here. One volunteer driving 18,000 kilometres to put up and service my signs. I alone did 20,000 kilometres in about 6 weeks getting around West Coast Tasman. It is the most spectacular electorate in the country. 8 national parks in or bound on my electorate. Beat that. And Mr Speaker, I'm sure nowhere else in the world could claim that, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, yes, there was a reality that we didn't do too well in the election, and we have a lot to learn from that. And I think each and every one of us in Labour are going away listening and will be taking on board the lessons of a campaign that didn't give us a brilliant outcome, Mr Speaker. And what makes it more frustrating is that we will be sitting here while the national government continues on its path to destruction for our country, Mr Speaker. I have found it hard to celebrate since getting elected back in, because the National Party is taking this country away from the values and the aspirations that people fought for through 2 world wars and other conflicts, who people worked hard for to build this country to what it is, a fair country, a country where any child from any town or any city should be able to reach the heights of their talents and their aspirations and their wishes. Mr Speaker, that is no longer true, unfortunately, and I've seen this country since 2008 head down the wrong path. Indeed, Mr Speaker, some could say we're moving from social welfare to corporate welfare. And we've gone from a caring to a sharing country. The problem is that the sharing is just among the mates of the National Party over there, among those who have the wealth, who have the control, and who happen to be getting a bigger slice of the pie, Mr Speaker. And nowhere is this better explained than having a look at social welfare fraud versus tax evasion, Mr Speaker. And if you look through it, in 2011 a study was done, it's a couple of years ago, but there's been not much change. It was estimated there was about $39 million of social welfare fraud across this economy. No one condones fraud in any way. At the same time, in the same year, there was $1 to $6 billion of tax evasion, Mr Speaker. $1 to $6 billion. And we hear lots from the ministers over there and all the pious MPs about how we have to clamp down on ACC fraud. We heard figures today, how we have to clamp down on DPB fraud. And we hear occasionally about tax evasion. In fact, today, the minister made an announcement and said that overseas companies that were evading tax effectively had another 5 years before the government would clamp down on them. Mr Speaker, I looked at some of the figures. Average benefit fraud of $70,000. It's quite high, I have to say. The chances of going to jail if convicted are 60% on a figure of $70,000. Average tax fraud, on the other hand, $270,000. You've got a 22% chance of going to jail, Mr Speaker. That is the seeping mentality driven by the national government that has allowed judges to impose those quite unfair penalties on New Zealanders. Mr Speaker, we don't condone any fraud, but just get it fair, get it right, and don't look after mates. Mr. Speaker, we've gone from a country that has tried its best to create real wealth through primary sectors, and we've had a couple of people speaking, in fact the Minister before, spouting on about what wonderful things that the national government is doing. Mr. Speaker, we've gone to speculation from real wealth creation. Because the National Party used to be made up of a fair chunk of farmers, and there were jokes made about that, but at least they were people who understood. Shane Ardern was one here who had worked hard to create a farm, worked hard to create some real wealth, but he's moved on. And in his place, we've got traders, we've got academics, we've got lawyers, and we've got an influx of PR spin doctors into the National Party. And so what's that done, Mr. Speaker? It's shifted their heroes. Their heroes are now the people who run NZX, Mr. Speaker, the banks, the overseas investors, the insurance companies, Mr. Speaker, the real estate agents. Those are the heroes of the National Party, and those are the people the National Party's looking after very, very well. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Thompson, senior real estate agent in Auckland the other day, said, well, it's pretty hard, pretty tough for those people who don't have a home, but they're just going to have to lower their expectations. Lower their expectations. You know why? He doesn't want more homes built. He wants a constrained market to push up prices so that every sale gives a better deal to a real estate and a real estate company, Mr. Speaker. And the banks can loan more money and they can all walk away with record profits as they have been doing. And that's the environment that this national government is creating in this country. Mr. Speaker, it is unfair. It is not right, and it is not the country that our ancestors fought for and worked hard for, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we didn't get capital gains tax right in selling it. We've got to look at it again. But the principle is sound. If someone can make $100,000 selling a house in 2 years' time and pay no tax, and someone working hard at $50,000 a year pays about a third of their salary or their income or their wages in tax, that is unfair, Mr. Speaker. So somehow we have to show New Zealanders that fairness should be underlying everything this government does. And so we'll look again at capital gains tax as a way of keeping things fair. Mr. Speaker, there are two things that are major problems in this country: the value of houses, the cost of houses, the affordability of houses, and the second one, for that trader and speculator over there, is the cost of farmland. Is the cost of farmland, Mr. Speaker, because we now have farmland going at about $40,000 per hectare, Mr. Speaker, on average for dairy, and people struggling to make way at that level. And what the government's going to do, and Lochinvar Station's a classic, open the doors to foreign investors to ensure that rural property values remain high and the banks don't take a bath and all their mates can walk away with the money in their pocket, and the foreign investors who get the money at 1% can come in and make it pay, maybe just. Mr. Speaker, it is wrong, because the value of New Zealand farmland is overvalued. It needs to go through a readjustment, Mr. Speaker, so that young New Zealanders can afford to get onto a farm, create real wealth and support our rural communities, Mr. Speaker. I'll finish on one classic example of corporate welfare. PGP, my previous speaker mentioned it, Mr. Speaker. 17 programs, one completed, Mr. Speaker. $350 million of taxpayers' money without any accountability at all. One complete, Mr. Speaker. I went to the report and it's stump to pump, it's forest waste into biofuels, and it says, quote, has potential, will take longer to establish a test plant because energy market has softened and biofuels development is more challenging. This is a $13 million project, $6.75 million of taxpayers' money, and that's all they come up with, Mr. Speaker. And the rest of the 16 projects will do no better. Mark my words, the Auditor General's investigating and hopefully will expose one of the greatest examples of corporate welfare that this country has seen for a long time. And Mr. Speaker, the National Party has insulted the primary sector by forcing it down the throats of a few privileged in the primary sector, while the farming sector matches at 1-to-1 and the farmers have paid the rest of it. Mr Speaker, this national government is taking New Zealand down the gurgler, and the sooner we get rid of them, the better.
Just before I call the honourable member, I just want to point out to David Seymour that it's not the tradition to bring briefcases or school bags into the House.